this video, we're going to talk about graphing sine and cosine functions. First, the vocabulary. A sine graph is an up and down graph and repeats every 360 degrees, or at 2 pi. A cosine graph is also an up and down graph that repeats every 360 degrees, or at 2 pi. The amplitude is the height of a sine or cosine graph. Example 1. The table below contains some exact values of sine. It also shows some approximations to those values. Complete the table using a unit circle to help you. So we look at our unit table. Let's use some different colors. Let's use gold for our radians. So our radians at 0, we're at 0 radians. At 90, we're at pi over 2. At 180, we're at pi. At 270, we're at 3 pi over 2. And then at 360, we're back to 2 pi. For our exact values of sine, that's our y value. So let's use this ocean color. So at 0, we're at 0. At pi over 2 and 90, we're at 1. At pi, we're at 0. At 3 pi over 2, we're at -1. And back at 2 pi, we're at 0. And let's pick one other color for our cosine. We'll use this lava color. Cosine recalls our x values. So this is our x. This is our y's. So at 0, we're at 1. At pi over 2, we're at 0. At pi, we're at -1. At 3 pi over 2, we're at 0. And at 360, we're back to 1. So now we're going to use this information to help us graph. So first, let's label our graph. So the center will be 0. Then we're going to skip 1 to pi over 2. Skip 1 to pi. Skip 1 to 3 pi over 2. And skip 1 to 2 pi. And then going backwards, we have -pi over 2. -pi. -3 pi over 2. And -2 pi. Okay, we're going to grab the sine in the ocean. The sine starts at 0. Oops, we have the 0, 1, 2. We'll quickly label our x-axis 0, -1, -2. So you go from 0 to pi over 2 is going to be 1. Back to 0 at pi. -1 at 3 pi over 2. And 2 pi will be 0. And following the same path backwards, negative pi over 2 would be -1. Negative pi is going to be 0. -3 pi over 2 is going to be +1. And -2 pi is going to be 0. And we just trace it and we get this up and down motion. So our graph should look something like this. And we're done. Now to graph the cosine, we're going to graph that on the same axis. So at 0, we're at 1. At pi over 2, we're going to be at 0. At pi, we're going to be at -1. At 3 pi over 2, we're going to be at 0. And at 2 pi, we're going to be at +1. At negative pi, we're going to be at 0. At negative pi, we're going to be at -1. At -3 pi over 2, we're going to be at 0. And -2 pi, we're going to be at 1. And we just trace it to get our up and down motion, just like the sine graph. And we're done graphing the sine and cosine function. Let me just retrace that to get a better picture. And we're we're done. Example 2. Graph y equals 1/2 cosine of x over 2 periods. So first let's make a little table. And we'll just stick to radians. So x would be our radians. Y would be our cosine of x. And then we have 1/2 cosine x. Let's just write cosine x to make it simple. So we have 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So ocean will be, or let's use aqua would be our, or lava would be our regular cosine. So remember it starts at 0 and 1, pi over 2 and 0, pi and -1, 3 pi and 0, and then back to 1. Now let's pick a different color for, let's use silver. So half of 1, so this is saying half of this value, so that would be half. Then half of 0 is 0. Half of -1 is going to be -1/2. Half of 0 is going to be 0, and half of 1 is going to be 1/2. So now let's label our axis. So we have pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Then we have negative pi over 2, negative pi, -3 pi over 2, and -2 pi. And going up on the axis, we're going to have 1, 2, 1, 2 in the negative direction. Now let's start graphing our graph. So the regular cosines will be graphed in the lava. So we start at 1, 0, -1, 3 pi over 2, and at 0, and 2 pi at 1. And going back, negative pi over 2 is going to be 0, negative pi is going to be -1, -3 pi over 2 is going to be 0, and -2 pi is going to be back to 1. Trace it. And our graph's going to look something like this. Now in the silver, we're going to do 1/2 cosine x. So at 0 at 1/2, at pi over 2 we're going to be at 0, at pi we're going to be at -1/2, at 3 pi over 2 we're going to be at 0, and 2 pi we're going to be at 1/2. At negative pi over 2 we're going to be at 0, at negative pi we're going to be at -1/2, at -3 pi over 2 we're going to be at 0, and then at -2 pi we're going to be at 1/2. So trace it. And it's slightly less flat than the traditional graph or parent graph of cosine of x, and we're done. Example 3. Graph y equals 2 sine of x over 2 periods. So let's first make our table. Graph x, 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Then we're going to have our normal sine x values. So that would be at sine of 0 is going to be 0, then we have 1, then we have back to 0, -1, and then 0. And then we're going to graph our 2 sine x. So 2 sine x means double the values of sine x. So 2 times 0 is going to be 0, 2 times 1 is going to be 2, 2 times 0 is going to be 0, and 2 times -1 is going to be -2, and 2 times 0 is going to be 0. So now we're going to graph it. So we're at pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi, negative pi over 2, negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2, and negative 2 pi. So now we're just going to graph our sine. Sine of 0 is going to be 0. Just label 1, 2, negative 1, negative 2. Then we're up to 1, back to 0, down to negative 1, and back to 0 at 2 pi. At negative 1/2, we're going to be at negative 1. At negative pi, we're going to be at 0. At negative 3 pi over 2, we're going to be at positive 1. At negative 2 pi, we're going to be at 0. So just trace it to get that up and down motion. And we're done graphing sine of x. So now let's graph 2 sine of x. At 0, we're at 0. At pi over 2, we're at 2. At pi, we're back to 0. At positive 3 pi over 2, we're at negative 2. And at 2 pi, we're back to 0. At negative pi over 2, we're at negative 2. At negative pi, we're at 0. At negative 3 pi over 2, we're going to be back to 2 pi. And at negative 2 pi, we're back to 0. So trace it. So take note that the graph is steeper or goes up higher than the traditional sine of x graph, and we're done.